Hello, hello. Oops, I guess I got to turn on
Hello.
the camera there. There we go. How are you?
Hi, how you doing?
All right. How was your trip?
Good.
Did you have a trip?
I'd go on a trip.
Oh, somebody else must have told me they were traveling.
Yeah. I wish I did go on a trip, but I'm stuck.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hey, Wendy, how you doing? Sorry, mouthful. I gotcha.
Yeah, I'm grabbing some popcorn.
That was my
Good.
life as well today.
Did you
Good.
bring enough to share?
Ah, hi, Betsy. I had the grandkids and just got home, so it's chocolate and popcorn and wine and everything else I can shove in the mouth, right?
There you go. All right, we'll give folks another minute or two, and then we will get going. It's going to be a little bit all over the map today because I am a little all over the map today. So I'm going to be starting with a setting today instead of ending with it. I've been between teaching this weekend and some work I've been doing for two shows that I've got coming up back to back. My hands are giving me trouble. So I'm going to actually temporarily skip the 2 crown settings, which will take a lot more hand strength than I've got right now. And we're going to do the very first basket setting. And then we'll go back and do the crown settings when I have had time to recover, frankly. I started to do a reminder practice one last night and just couldn't get the strength to grip what I needed to grip. And so the basket setting is a little more delicate. But we'll start with that and then go to a couple of the settings that are left over from the last chapter, just because I would like to do a basket setting. So I'm gonna. I like basket settings. And we made the pliers after all, so why not? Anybody have questions since last time or anything exciting?
I do have a comment.
Sure.
I mean, I hate to tell you, but John made my pliers when I was in a workshop, so I have all the ground in the right places. Yay!
Yeah,
He did mine.
nice. Yeah, I mean, it's part of it is it depends on the quality of the tweezers you start with, I think, as to how good they are. So I've had a couple that I'm like, that doesn't quite feel like as good a grip as others, and I haven't checked to see whether it's specific manufacturers or not, because I tend to just buy whatever Rio has when I'm buying these in batches. But I do know that I have made the mistake of getting the titanium ones and spending a lot of money and snapping them. So the steel ones only. Hello, hello, Karen. Hello,
How was the
everyone.
workshop, Rachel?
Good. It was intense. It was my first time teaching for Metalworks. I had an awesome TA, and we technically we had 9 students in the class, but one person was not attending in person. They're going to watch the videos. So that was fun. And it was originally designed to be a 3-day class, and I jammed a little more than I should have in a 2-day class probably. So their heads may be exploding, but all in all, it went pretty well, I think.
That's good.
That's wonderful.
Yep. I love Metalworks as a program, and I think they put on some amazing classes, both in person and virtually.
Right.
I'm glad they were able to and survive.
Yeah.
If you haven't taken a class at Metalworks, by the way, in person, you want to go because it's the dream studio. They have it so well organized, so meticulously laid out, so every tool you could possibly want. It's amazing. And every time you think, oh, no, I can't see such and such, they don't have it. Yeah, they send you into a back corner and you pull it out of the very neatly organized cupboards or the rolling carts, or, there's stuff that's locked away for special classes. And there's
really nice
people too. So yeah, it's
really
worth it.
Cool.
If you haven't done the East Coast circuit of good schools, they're up there, and Haystack Mountain up in Maine, if you want a nice vacation / class. Arrowmont down in Tennessee is a lot of fun. I've heard great things about Penland from friends who have gone. I have yet to actually make it, although Penland's classes tend to be a little more intense and a little more expensive. And there's just a boatload of great schools on the East Coast. So
Yeah.
check them out. Snow Farm in Massachusetts. I'm tired and I'm going to ramble if I keep going on those. So it looks like we've got who we've got today. And I'm just going to do the usual. I think everybody here is a regular, so I don't need to go into all the super duper details. Does anybody need the Rio for Schools ID or anything? Have you all gotten that in past sessions? Okay. I know Rio just did a major upgrade to their website, so things still may not be working quite right. So it may be that at some point, if you start seeing that you're not getting the super duper prices, put the ID back in and see if it accepts it. But
The
boy,
website is terrible right now.
it is. Their poor team is so stressed. It's ridiculous. If you are having trouble with it, they're recommending that you call, but it's going to be a bit of a wait is my guess. Count on more time and watch your bank account for errors. They sometimes are billing multiple times by accident. So their upgrade did not go as well as planned is what it comes down to. But they're slowly chipping away at it from the sound of things.
Never smooth.
Pardon?
It's never smooth.
No,
Think
it's
it is,
not.
but
It's
no.
not. And I know that they're trying to give us a much better experience in the end, and I can see where they're headed. But having been on the developer side of projects like that, I can also completely understand that the integration with their systems is more painful than anyone expected. So either way, they're very helpful people on the other end of the phone when you call. So if you have problems with the website itself, sometimes it's faster to call. Let's see, what else do I need to update you guys on? So what I have planned, and we'll see how long my hands can cope with this day, because really they're cramping like crazy, is I'm going to start out with a basic 4-prong basket setting, which will set us off for the series of those. I'm hoping next session, I've got 2 shows between now and next session, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to get some practice time in to get the crown settings back on track. But if not, we may do a couple of basket settings and then come back to it towards the end of the chapter. It's really going to depend on my focus, frankly. But today, after that, I expect to try to show you what I've come up with for those funky stones that we had to set. So this is the reverse setting that has the conical stone set into it and has the cap that goes in place and gets set like a bezel. So I played around based on some of the ideas you helped recommend last time as to how I would rig that. And then we also have the other reverse setting, which is the one where we put a little jump ring inside and set over the jump ring from the back. So buried down in here is that long tapered stone that I have. And then the other thing I was going to do, although we won't get to setting it today, is I was going to show you the technique for cutting in on the top of the briolettes, just using the separating disc. This is what I've come up with, even though it's a little pimply looking, to hold my stones securely, because these are slippery little suckers. And so trying to hold it while also having a spinning separating disc near my fingers didn't make me happy. So I'll show you how to do that cut in. And for that, you'll see, I'll not be able to talk too much because I'll be in a full mask. I want to reiterate what I will say every time we talk about cutting stones, which is wear your face mask and not just a COVID style mask. Wear one that keeps the particulates and the nasty stuff that comes off of it out, because stone dust is in your lungs and doesn't go away, and silicosis and other things like that.
Rachel, are you going to start page 96? Where are we starting?
So we're going to start on, good question. We're going to start on page 92 today. 92, because I want to point out a bunch of things. But yes, well, those are the things that we will cover after we have done a setting. And the only other thing I want to remember to tell you is that here's one of those handy dandy, wouldn't it be nice if you had them around when you need them tools. You guys had suggested that I do a little pre-gluing for this stone, and I was trying to figure out how to get it glued in without getting it all over everything. And boy, it's a perfect fit for just inside of a clip. So find the tools where you have them. And we'll come back to all of those So, oh, I got to spotlight myself. I always forget to spotlight. I wish there was a way to set it to auto spotlight. Okay. Today we're starting at the soldering bench, and we are using 16 gauge wire because I'm going to do a fairly large stone. I'm going to do the larger of these 2 rounds here, just because it's easier to see. You will probably find that the very small and the very large stones are more challenging to make baskets for than not. But John tells us that he likes the 16 gauge for larger stones. I've got this going. So I'm just going to anneal a chunk of 16 gauge wire. Wire is always easier to anneal in a coil because then you're less likely to anneal different parts of it at different temperatures, or, get some of it really melty. I'd rather do a slightly bigger coil, but I know I'm not going to use all that much material. So just trying to get an even coil. And we really want it nicely annealed because we're going to have to straighten it out as our first act. So I'm going to quench this. Get back over to the bench. And so, oh, you know what? I meant to point out some things in this section before we get into it. I want to point out something that was a surprise to me in the detailed reading of this on page 92, top right column, wire or basket settings section. Though most wire settings have 2 bearings, an upper and a lower, this is more a matter of convention than of function. I had always thought that it was a matter of function and keeps things straight, or keeps things firmly in place. But he says otherwise. So I'm gonna trust that. It feels to me like it's more likely that the prongs will catch on something and bend backwards if they're just standalone. I think I might be more comfortable putting a single on a cabochon than I would on like a diamond or something like that. But that may just be that I've learned all this time that you should always have more support, not less. So that's a thing that he says specifically, he calls out. And then the 4 to 6 millimeter stones, he says 18 gauge is sufficient, larger stones 16 gauge. One thing that I don't think he specifies in here, but I'll point out, is this doesn't necessarily have to be done with round wire. You can get some really cool effects by using square wire or half round wire for your prongs, or even carefully for your bearings. So think about it when you start playing around with variations. I also love that he goes through a series of different combos. So we're starting with the 4, but we'll play around with the even and odd numbers as they go up. And the big thing to remember on this is the proportion is very important. So on page 93, he's drawing the reality of a badly designed earring. So the left one is a nice stable post. The right one is such that if we were to put it on a post, it would just tip on the ear. It might be okay for a ring or something like that, but it's still going to catch on a lot of things if it's sticking out that much. So just try to be conscious of what you're using it for. And also down at the bottom of page 93, he's showing us the height issue and how you can make something sit too far up off of the supporting bearing, and then it becomes weaker because, again, it's physics. We've got a fulcrum, we've got more room for it to pull when it catches on something, and that's why it's going to splay, which is why I originally thought you need 2 because it helps keep the fulcrum point a little bit tighter in. But I guess that doesn't matter. If you keep your prongs low enough, it's not going to matter whether you have 1 bearing or 2 technically. So with that in mind, I'm going to point out and show you the thing that he shows us in a little picture for straightening wire, which is why we have at my bench my tiny little vise set up here, and why I have my tongs here. So if you don't have a pair of these and you try to draw wire, more power to you, but wow, you're working up extra hard. So these are draw tongs. Oops, I'm not in camera, hang on. Draw tongs, which have the teeth, and then have a hook. And then they're nice because you can add a device like that. You can add this to a rolling, excuse me, a draw plate machine so that it's got something to grip on, and it gives just a little extra support. I do not have one set up. John gave us directions in one of my classes for building one, and I just haven't gotten around to it. But the gist of it is, for our small amounts of wire, we can just do the work in a vise. Let me get this out of here to make my life a little easier. And I always assume that I'm going to scrap a little bit of the end wire because I need a good grip on it. So tightening this in firmly, I have annealed it, and then you're not going to be able to see the whole pole. Let me see if I can give you the view if I go to the other camera. So I'm going to grip snugly and pull. Got to make sure my vise is well attached to the table for this. But the tug is going to start straightening it out. So metal is, this silver is in particular is really stretchy. It doesn't, you don't quite realize it until you start pulling on it, but you can actually add an amount of length to a piece. And then I got to watch that I haven't made it too curvy. This is still a little more curvy than I want to work with. So I'm going to pull, grip and pull again. And I'm trying to just use, and in this case, I'm trying to use my body weight against the pull to try and get it nice and straight. That does an okay job of it. If you're doing smaller bits, you can roll it between two steel blocks, but I've still got curve in there, which probably means I should go back and anneal it a little bit more. I don't want to curl it back up again, coil it back up again, because then I'll just have to get that curve out. But that gets me the basic straightening of it. I've got any kinks out of it that were in there, etc. I'm going to actually trim this down a little bit so I can do two pieces at once. But I really want this as straight as possible, because if I don't take this step, my creation of the prongs is going to become a lot harder. Because we're counting on being able to make the prongs parallel to one another. And any little wobble reflects pretty consequentially in such a small scale setting. Softer. So dry these off and give it another pull. The challenge, by cutting these, I've made it harder for me to straighten, because the longer length you're working with, the more pull, more force you'll be able to put into the pull. Just it's that much easier to grip and so on. So you don't want to try and straighten a tiny little piece with this technique. Pulling and twisting. Oops, you're not going to. I can give you my grimacy face, or I can give you part of the wire in place. I can't give you both. Oh. So, all right, that's looking pretty good. Still not perfect, but it's far better than it was. So that was part one. This is part two, and so I've got a fairly decent straight line. I'm going to clear my vise out of the way, and that brings us to page 94, where I want to point a couple other things out. So size of the bearings that we're making is important. because I thought I'd switch to my face cam, because the upper bearing needs to be no bigger around the outside than the girdle itself. It shouldn't be peeking out over the edges. It is the resting platform in essence. So we don't want it to have excess. It can be a little bit smaller, but it shouldn't be a whole lot smaller. And then the bottom one is what defines how steep our proportions are in the design. We can do a setting that's perpendicular, straight up. They can be the two exact same size, and it'll be a very sort of pillar-like setting for it. But then if we make a slightly smaller bottom bearing, we start to get the angles until we get to a point where the angles are so steep that it's hard to get the prongs over it. So in his inimicable way, when you ask him, what does that mean? He'll say, you do as much as you need to do, or he'll say, enough. That's how far you go. I can't tell you the angles specifically, but I can tell you that a lot of bezel blocks come in either 17 degrees or I want to say 23 degrees. There's two common traditional conical angles that are used in the industry. And when you look at a bezel block, it should be marked with which angle it is. And prongs can tend to follow that conical setting. So just know that there's a certain limited range of angles you want. And that's where he's given us the too large, too small, just right Goldilocks effect up in the top drawings. Let's see. I want to point out that he says very clearly that throughout this, we're using our hard solder all the way through. We don't want to switch down levels, which is part of the challenge when you're first doing these. And the profile, what else did I want to make sure I mark? I want to point out in relation to that angle business on page 95, when we get to filing the angles in, it's important that we mark the top of each jump ring, because what he wants us to do is not file a straight channel like we might if we're attaching a jump ring to a sidewall or something, but he wants us to prepare it with the angle that we're aiming for from the small base to the upper bearing. So keep that in mind as we're going through these steps, that we want to keep that precision and always know which way is up, which is a good practice in life, I suppose. So let's see. I feel like I'm getting a lot of glare at the bench. Let's see. Maybe I gotta adjust my lights a little bit. Is that less glary to you guys? Is that okay for visibility? Yeah, that looks a little better. Okay, so we have our straightened out wire and our stone. And the first thing we're going to do is make a jump ring that is for the upper bearing, which is what's going to rest right around this part of the stone. Okay. And so I'm going to just ballpark where I want to be and start around a mandrel. You can also do this around your, oh my gosh, words are failing me. Those things. If you have a set of dapping tools, there we go. That's the word that was failing me. You can also start these around a dapping tool or something else. And we want to check to make sure that we are not bigger than where the stone's girdle is. So I shouldn't be able to see the girdle beyond it. Well, that's impressively close to what I want. I think I want it ever so slightly snugger than that. I'm going to trim that a little in from where I would have. Okay, going to do the usual filing and cleaning up. Get a nice clean fit.
Rachel,
Mm-hmm.
so did you use the dapping tool that is the circumference of the stone?
You
want me to put
absolutely
in there?
could. You'd want to go a step or two smaller of us because metal has that springiness. So you're going to want to go a little, if you're trying to measure it by saying, hey, it fits right on top of it, take 1 or 2 sizes down from that and wrap your metal around the smaller cycle. In this case, I'm just using a tapered mandrel. And I just ballparked based on what I did was I eyeballed about where it looks like the diameter of the thing is close to what the size of the stone would be if I were down that far. That's how I eyeballed it. And then I'm checking it and tightening it up based on when I start to put it together. Is it showing just enough of the girdle beneath it?
Okay,
Yeah, but
okay, cool.
anything can be a mandrel if you got the right shape for it, you know, and if it won't break on you.
For some reason, my video is going on and off, so I'm missing steps.
Uh-oh. Is
know,
anybody
it's
else
just-
having that trouble?
Yes.
Nope.
Oh,
No,
okay.
So we were having something like that on the Zoom call before
Yeah.
for my Metalworks class. I'm kind of wondering if Zoom is having issues, because if it were on my end, I would expect everybody to have the problem.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was kept freezing. Yeah, on and off.
So
that's happened to me before and then it just picks up, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's universal.
Yeah.
maybe, you know, lots of parts of the country are having these heat waves. It won't be surprising to me if there are brownouts in various key power locations around the country right now. Okay, so I've got a jump ring in 16 gauge. I'm going to pop over and solder this with hard solder. And this is one of the reasons I've got the chip solder, is because I wanted to use it for making sure I stay fairly low end quantities of solder. When I go with wire solder, I tend to overdo it. And especially once we start attaching the prongs, because I don't want to have to clean up these tiny, tiny settings if I don't have to. Shift it a little, there we go. So what you saw me doing there at the end was tapping down. Sometimes if it torques with the heat hitting it, you can keep it flowing and use a pair of steel tweezers light touch to just position the wire, you know, sort of encourage the wire back down in line. That one was starting to do at the joint. It did a little tiny bit of lift, so all I did was push it back into place while I was in a flux, I mean a fluid state. And that's one of those learn to walk and chew gum at the same time kind of exercises, where if you can get it down, oops, I didn't switch cameras, did I? Come on, little camera. If you can walk and chew gum at the same time, it'll improve your ability to touch things up in the moment. You know, you won't spend as much time turning off the torch and so on. So now I'm rounding it again, but I'm trying to make sure that I do not also stretch it terribly. Or if I have a penchant for stretching, I'm going to actually make my jump ring smaller and account for that, knowing that I'll stretch it as I go. That's fairly round, if not perfectly round. So there I've got, I don't know if I can, if my camera shows it pretty top down, but so I've got it just shy of the size of the outer ring. Let me see if I can show it from the top. Maybe it'll show a little better that way. Of the girdle size. So I could probably go like a 1/4 millimeter bigger on this if I wanted to. But this should do pretty well. What it's going to do is note that it's going to sit down on that ring, basically where it lands in this position. I'm sorry, my fingers are not holding things well. So looking at it from the side, it's just below the girdle, but it may be a little more below the girdle than I want. So I think I am going to try to stretch this up a smidge, but like, again, 1/4 millimeter stretch kind of thing. Don't want to overdo it because I don't want to have to resolder because I stretched it too much. So all I'm doing is trying to stretch it a smidge on the mandrel, doing the flip. Both sides
Okay,
stretched.
so the ring should be like a tiny bit lower than the girdle or on the girdle?
So no, it shouldn't be around the girdle. The girdle is going to be just above the ring when we wrap. Here, let me draw this one because this is so tiny. I can't hold it in a way that you guys are seeing. And he's got a good picture. Well, he has parts of it pictured. So he's showing where he wants it up on page 95, image 1. Oh. In the book on page 95, image 1 on the left is basically what he's telling us to do. So but he doesn't give us a side view. So if we have,
Okay. So that's the bottom part. That circle is the bottom part. And
this,
of where,
so no, we're gonna do we're making first this ring, the upper bearing. Later, we're gonna make this ring.
okay.
Okay, but so he wants this to be somewhere between there and sort of right below. That's a bad line. Hang on. Right below the girdle. What you're not doing is putting it here. It's not supposed to be at the girdle, right? Because what's holding this into position in our stone is that it rests on this line. If it goes through, it'll fall down into the next step down.
Okay.
So we're making one that just barely fits beneath the girdle. And it can be a little tiny bit small, but it shouldn't be big. It shouldn't go to the point where the girdle is trying to rest through it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I just can't show this visually enough that you guys can see. Here, maybe that side view does it. So my girdle is right where my fingernail is.
Mhm.
And then this stone is going to let it rest just below that point.
That's quite a distance.
Pardon?
It's quite a distance.
It's actually, so the problem is I chose a dark stone and I shouldn't have. Hang on, let me switch to the power camera and see if I can get a better view, because it's not too close. Let's see if I can. So when this is in position, that's my girdle up to that point, and there's just a little bit of room below the girdle. So if it's resting, see if I can find a way to show this to you guys. If it's resting, the girdle is just there. That's where it ends. So I could probably make this one more smidge. Oops, I'm out of camera.
You're out
sorry.
of frame.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, go lower. Yeah, that's good.
And
Thank
I'm
you.
trying to get it both at an angle that you guys can see it, but also where it's going to be resting. So there's basically like a pick's worth. When this is resting flat, there's about a pick's thickness between the top of that and the base of the stone, of the girdle rather. But I could still go a tiny bit bigger on this ring. So I think I will. And the other thing I need to do is make sure I flatten the stone. I mean, flatten, not the stone, flatten the bearing, because this one's a little wobbly. Gosh, my hands do not want to do anything today. They're just so clumsy right now.
Can you change cameras?
Oh, thank you. Sorry. All I did was flatten the ring on my steel bench block. That's what you missed. But I'm going to stretch it a little more. Check it. This stone has a fairly steep cut. Just want to make sure that I'm giving it the max. Give it without going over. So this is another slightly faster stretch. So be careful you don't overdo it. All right, where did I drop the jump ring? There we go. By pushing it downward against the steel block, you'll stretch it faster. So make sure that you're, again, doing small steps at a time. I think that's about the max I want to risk stretching for now. So I'm going to leave that as my upper bearing, and then I'm going to make the lower bearing or the inner bearing. And I would like a bit of an angle on this one, so I'm going to make it slightly smaller than what I just did, which is going to be, that's the nice thing about once you have one made, you can go a little ways up from that. And you can sort of set up your proportions of where they're going to be. I think I want a little bit smaller than that still. I'd like a little more room for something this big. Looks pretty good. And you need to remember also that you want it to, the collet should not be poking out the bottom. So you can't make them too close together or else it'll poke out the end. So that's sort of the driving differential between what's too small and what's too big. That plus the angle you're aiming for. Switch to a better pair of cutters. And the first time I did one of these with John, I felt like I had spent infinity in terms of, just hours making 2 little jump rings. But the precision factor is what's important in this. The cleaner each of your steps is, the cleaner your end result will be, which I know sounds like kind of a duh thing, but it really, it exponentially multiplies the errors if you make a mistake early on, if you aren't as precise as you can be early on, which is of course a frustrating thing for me because me and precision, we're sort of a passing frenemy kind of relationship. I understand that there's a need. I just don't always want to abide. Okay, so proportionally. Oh, that got a lot smaller. I may want it. Yep, I managed to cut it in a different spot than I meant to. Let's try that one again. Okay, that feels like it's going to be where I want it to be proportionally, give or take. So back to the soldering block. Ooh, a little bit of cleanup before I do. Hard solder once again. As a reminder, if your stuff tends to open up as you go to solder it, heat up starting on silver, starting from the back side, and it'll help close the join together before you get to the soldering. It'll encourage the stretch direction to go towards the seam. checking that I've actually got flow all the way across. Good. Okay. Oops, I apologize. I thought I was zoomed out again. Let me get back to that. So all I did was solder the new jump ring. And back to the mandrel to re-round it. I'm gonna switch to my Bonnie Doon. I tend to get a better flattening with that. And remember that round mandrels come in a bunch of different tapers. So having, gosh, I'll make it through this night, guys, I promise. Where did I drop it now? So having a few different tapers gives you a couple different angles to help you set up your various angles of the basket setting. And I have completely lost this jump ring. Let's see. This is for my blooper reel on YouTube, guys.
Careful with your head when you come up.
Thank you. Good call
You have a
out.
flashlight?
Pardon?
Sometimes a flashlight helps because it
Yeah, I
picks it
think
up.
what's gonna help is me just making another one fast. It'll be faster.
Or that, yes.
Oh, no.
It happens. Okay, so where were we? Making this. Making the next one down a little smaller. Oh, did it? Did it just fling? No, that's the other one that I didn't like the size of. And if you're doing a lot of stones that are the same size, can you find jump rings that are 16 gauge and make them out of jump rings? Absolutely. Absolutely. But knowing how to get all the proportions right yourself means you have a lot more variety that you can make by hand. I used to be very cruel to my beginning students that were learning bezel setting for the first time and make them roll out their bezel wire. And I realized nobody's got time for that. There's reasons that that stuff is manufactured or that you can cut it from sheet. So I stopped doing that after about the third year because it was taking forever. And there were better things that they could have been learning, especially since they weren't planning on necessarily going into professional metalsmithing. They were all hobbyists. And I feel that way about things like manufactured jump rings. Sometimes you pay a little money to save some hours on your life.
You know, I totally agree with you. I did the tweezers.
Yep.
It took me like 2 days.
To do the filing on the tweezers.
Yeah. You know how you said make a second one? Well, of course, I did a third one just in case. So I did 3 of them.
Well, you've only got 2 hands with which to hold things. So that having 2 is nice because when you get into some of the fancier multiple settings, it'll help you hold them in place temporarily while you're making sure that everything is lined up. Oh gosh, darn it. That's the downside of hanging down. Got it this time. Maybe I pull out my bench tray like a smart jeweler. So having 2 of them, you're not going to use 2 of them while you're soldering necessarily, but in getting everything lined up and positioned, it's nice to have a pair so you can grip more than one of the legs that you're going to be putting on, which become the prongs at a time. Let's see what our relationship of sizes is here. Okay, that's not terrible. I want to flatten this one. Maybe a little too big.
So why are you flattening it?
Because I need them to be absolutely perpendicular to one another. I'm not flattening the curve of the metal. I'm flattening when there's a warp to my jump ring. So, because what I want is when they're together, this actually shows pretty nicely on here. They need to be parallel to one another, right? So I need them flat before I start putting them together, which is still a couple steps away, but we'll get there. To see what my proportion is, because what's going to happen is my stone, this is going to be barely enough for this to not have the coulette fit through, but my stone is going to rest on the top one and hopefully not pass by the bottom one. So I need to make sure that they proportionally fit well together, but not so close that the coulette pokes through. I hope that made any sense at all. Long day.
Yeah. But would you add a third one if it didn't really work?
You could decoratively if you wanted to. It's going to be a lot harder to solder because you're going to work it in staging. But also the truth is I can put these further apart than they were on that angle and still get the, make sure that I've got them raised higher. Can I show that sideways? So I don't have to have them as snug as they were on the mandrel. I can separate them further. I just wanted to see what I'd get for an angle with the size proportion I had. So this is a perfectly acceptable setting. I can go further. It's just the higher you get, then we get into that situation where it might tip over on whatever it's used on. So there's that, find what's the right happy medium. And then I need to know which one of these is the bigger of the two jump rings, because otherwise I'm going to screw myself up. There's the big one, there's the little one. I'm going to use the little one first, because the first sequence, which we are now on page, we are on page 94, working our way down towards the second half of the second column. We've flattened it. We've made sure that the outer diameter proportionally to the inner diameter, the outer diameter of the small one relative to the larger one is going to give us our angle. So I could have gone a little smaller with the ring, but I'm going to stick with what I've got. And now we are at the second to last paragraph where we want to, with a scribe, mark off the 4 points. Obviously, when we move on to the other number of prongs, we will mark off the appropriate number. And I can't for the life of me find it, and I'll try to find it and post it, but there's a great circle reference that you can print out on a piece of paper that gives you all different kinds of compass points in it. What I'm going to do instead is use my circle template and mark. And this is where it's important that we start looking at the top of the jump ring or the bearing ring, rather than just that it's a jump ring. We need to know which way is up on these. So I'm going to blacken my soon to be top of the bottom bearing, and then I'm going to use a scribe or some other sharp mechanism if I can find it. Had it out the other day. There we go. And mark the north, south, east, west. This is another one of those, precision is important. I know I'm getting in my own camera way and I apologize. Got to get in close enough to see what I'm marking. So I've marked out my quadrants. I know which is my top because I've blackened it. And now I'm going to start with a saw first and then work through various files. So he's got the steps on page 95 that we're about to go through. We're first doing a tiny saw blade cut as a starter on each of those corners. I mean, each of those quadrants, the north, south, east, west. Right at our mark points along the outer wall. And I always have to remind myself that slow gets me there faster. Because if I rush this, I will be not as neat and precise about my 4 quadrants as I need it to be. And my prongs will be lopsided. So I'm just putting my starter marks in. Oops, I lost one of my marks. Sec. Back to template. Line my 3 that I have marked properly up. Down, better score mark. Okay, I'm going to remark my top just so that I don't miss it. This time I'm going to do it in pink because then I'll remember. Top and triangle file next. And this is where we start to make sure we are working at the angle upward towards what we've marked as the top. So I'm taking those notches I made with the saw, and my instinct is to go this way, but I need to actually go this way so that I am making sure my angles start to get following the line I expect when I put the prongs in. I'm going to do a little bit of a triangle notch. I want to be careful not to go all the way through because I'm going to have to touch it up. I don't want to go all the way through no matter what, but I also need to leave myself the luxury of touching it up with a chenille or hinge file. So I'm sticking with that angle towards the top business. Okay, so I've got, I don't know that I'm going to be able to show this even on the tiny camera, but I've got notched marks coming up from the bottom towards the top. And then I'm going to go back in with the tiniest of possible chenille files, which get the itty bitty set that I have. So again, if you haven't got one of these, the chenille file is the one with filing only on one side or the other, but not on the wide surface. So it's just on the edges. And most chenilles have 2 curvatures to them, one that's almost flat and one that's got a little bit of a rounding to it. I'm going to be using the rounding, making sure I'm looking at my needs marking up again, top, pink side. And following that angle that I started to put into it with the triangle file, I'm just going to round it out. Because what I'm doing is making room for the resting position of the 16 gauge prongs that we're going to put into it in a moment. So you're going to want to watch that your chenille is actually giving you enough of a divot that if we were to take a piece of the 16 gauge and rest it up there, it would go resting nicely into the slot that we're making. And mine is not quite wide enough, so I'm gonna have to widen it out a little bit. I happen to have a fairly delicate little round file. Not a problem to use a round if you've got one that's tiny. Just make sure that you're not overdoing it, because the whole goal is get yourself better soldering surface area and get the prongs partially set in to the ring that we're using to support it, to the bearing ring. So again, always working the angle towards the top. Let's see how that's looking for our material. That feels much better. So now I've got a decent gap, a decent angle, and something that's going to really hold my material in place. A little bit further on that one. And they should be directly opposite one another. And angled upward. Okay, so I've now got my lower bearing, and the cuts in it are ready for the wire. So next step is I need to make one of the U's. I think actually maybe he has us do them both at the same time. Does he have us do them both at the same time? So we're very much not notching our upper bearing yet. We're only doing the lower bearing. Right. This is where he likes us to make the two U's, and he does these a lot over a pen or something like that. But again, you could do it over your DAPs if you've got one that's the right size. What we're trying to do is get two U's, one a little bit taller than the other, and they need to be so that they will fit snugly across your bearing. Gotta be right side up again. Pink. Wrong direction though. So what we're looking for is for it to pretty much hold itself in there, which means I need to be a little snugger than I've got, but I'm pretty close. And one of them, by doing two of them, where's my board? So when we put these on, it's going to be easier on us if one of them is shorter and the other one comes taller, so it can be below it. So they're not knocking into each other, but they're both going to be high enough that we'll have room to trim them back. So that's why we need two separate lengths, and they both need to fit across snugly. So I got to find a slightly smaller pen and tighten up this U. And you want to make sure again that your wire is staying straight and proportional, vertical to one another. Don't drop the jump ring after all that work. Still too big. I'm going to use my half round pliers and snug up this U a little tighter. But again, we're aiming for very perpendicular activity in our two lines. Okay, very close. I'm going to snip some off and tighten it up a little more. Okay, again, it's coming up from the bottom, so making sure you know which direction your angles are going. Sure we're flat as well.
Have you ever crazy glued something together and then soldered it?
So I know that trick. I'm not a fan of it because the chemicals in crazy glue are really awful for you. And I already burn enough garbage into my system with the soldering that I do. I'm not saying don't, because it's effective. Just make sure you got good ventilation and wear a mask. But that's why we have the wonderful tweezers that we've made. And I'm going to show you how those work in just a moment. I just need to get this ever so slightly more closed in so that it's helping support itself. So I've got one U. Oops, but now I've straightened it badly. You're going to want to check all the time that you don't have any kinks in this, that both your prongs are pointing parallel and upright, and that you are putting this in from the bottom. So there we go. That's what I'm looking for, is see how I can hold the ring in between them? That's how snug I want it when it is slotted into the U in the right direction, in the angled up direction. Overdone my tightening. Let's see. Okay, it's a little lopsided right now, but we're going to correct that in a moment. We're going to grab those pliers or the tweezers that we made. And we're looking to hold it this way, so the bottom pointed up, and then the grip of this that we designed in the tweezers is that the long side, the vertical grips along one leg or one prong, and then the slotted segments that we cut in, the ones we cut in this way hold the jump ring, and the ones that we cut in this way hold the leg or the prong. And what that does is let us make sure that we are perfectly lined up on the other side into the notch we've created. Okay, so we don't have to worry on this first one about are we vertical, are we horizontal, because all we're doing in this next exercise is soldering that one spot. And John repeats this a couple times. He wants you soldering one segment at a time, because we're going to do corrections in between each stage of soldering. Questions about how I got to that point? Okay, and I realize I haven't had chat up. I don't know if anybody's asking stuff on chat. Nope. Okay. Bear with me a sec. I got to get my chat out of the way now. Zoom is behaving badly. All right, we're going back over to the soldering station. And John is a magician that in his world, he does this all held in his hands at once with like tongs and tweezers and everything and this and that. And then he just sort of manipulates the torch around it. I am not quite such a magician. I'm going to...
You're a little out of frame.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm actually going to move my brick out of the way. I'm going to use the brick to hold it so that I can control things a little bit more, because I cannot do the 3 tools in my hand at once magic that he does. And he says a slightly bushy, but the regular size tip. I was early on, I was taught try to use the tiny tips, and for gold you may want to, but he does a lot of this flicking action, and our goal is to get a tiny amount of solder just to the inside of where the ring meets the prong. And he does tweezers. I tend to do pick solder for this because I can't hold my tweezers steady enough. And we're just trying to get solder to flow without hitting that leg too much. There we go. So it's tiny, tiny little soft soldering to get the join right there. Quench. And now we're going to do our first adjustment, because we've got a one point that is soldered together, but the other side we can correct as needed. I have it fluxed, but I don't have much else. And so what I'm going to do is I have a little bit of a tilt and I have a little bit of a lift up. So I'm going to go back to the bench and grab some pliers and reposition to get it nice and straight, because I want everything parallel or perpendicular to whatever it's supposed to be. So I'm adjusting for a little bit of flatness. I want to make sure my prongs are still opposite each other and slotted into the slot as expected. And I want to make sure that I've got everything equidistant. The equidistant to the ground is not going to impact us so much on this step. It's when we put the next one in that we need to make sure our relationship between the top and the bottom are all there. So this is my first easy correction. They get steadily harder as we go. And now I'm going to hold on to the side that I just soldered, again in that same grip the upright and with the vertical, and grip the jump ring with the horizontal cuts that we've made to stabilize it. And we're now aiming for soldering this side. Same deal, hard solder. And this definitely gets faster the more you do it. Now, I would not be quite doing so much stop and go. I do a lot more of this at the bench here. In fact, I still need to go back to the bench for the next step. So there's more talk time in this than there is build time, is I guess what I'm saying. So you'll get, the first one will take you a lot longer, and you're likely to have the time the next time, or at least 2/3 the time. So again, lightweight. Flickering past. There we go. Questions on this so far? Anyone?
I have a question. I didn't
Sure.
notice that there was anything wrong for you to adjust the
So
first time around.
what I was seeing was that my platform, so think of this ring, this ring as a platform on which, well, in this case, the stone is going to poke through it. It's not going to actually rest on it. But both of these we want level, and I had it doing this on the connection. So I needed to make sure that it was upright. Now, I can always trim more away, so it's going to be flat to the ground on the bottom of this. So it's really the second one that makes the very important, it needs to be level. But again, this is one of those settings where if you make every adjustment as soon as you see it, it'll be a lot easier to get it smooth than trying to correct after the fact. So now that I have two things on here to try and flatten everything again is a little trickier, two solder joints. But I'm still going to try. I'm going to do any corrections I can see, just double checking that I've got it nice and flat all the way around. And I now am going to work on the next U, which again, I'm going to make a little bit longer than the first U because I need to get it past the one that's already there. What I mean by that is I need it to be able to sit on top, right? Or I need to be able to tuck it under, but that's a little more awkward. I guess I suppose I could tuck it under like that. But either way, we've got to get it fitted between the other ones. And again, I start my process here by making sure that I'm as straightened out as I can be. And I'm going a little overboard on the height of the prongs, mostly for visibility. You'll get better and better at making them nicely trimmed down to heights that will be useful to you. Because when we add our second jump ring that I please did not lose. Oh, I left it on the mandrel on purpose. So once we add our second jump ring, we're only going to be about here. About here for height. I've got plenty of prong excess. I don't need that much. Help me remember that I keep putting this back on the mandrel so I don't lose it. Let's see, what was I doing? I was straightening this out, and then we're gonna put the other two legs on. And once again, our goal is to get this as snug and parallel to one another as possible so that it kind of holds itself into the channels that we've made. Oh, a little too wide still. I do recommend that if you've never done a basket setting, start with a stone that's a little bit on the larger side. The smaller they get, the more fiddly and frustrating they can be. All right, so back to my magical tweezers. And once again, we're gripping the side that's opposite what we're soldering. Let me, a little guy. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling so clumsy. Make sure it's in the slot that you want it in. And it's not quite squared up. Let's see. Oh, it's trying to come out of its little slot. That's why. Go. Oop. All right, let's try this again. Straighten out again. Channels. Here. Okay. Again, we're doing only one solder seam at a time. Your instinct will be try to get it all done in one swoop, but that will not serve you well for straightening everything out. My solder's going hard solder on the inside, resting, basically I'm resting on what will become the bottom of the setting. And it gets trickier as you add these extra legs because you want to not overheat anything that you've already done. You got to just get it flowing. That little flick is what does the magic on this soldering. So we now got 3 points soldered, and we're going to start straightening the last leg out to make sure that everything is clean. And what we're going to aim for is, I've got a little bit of distortion in the 4 points. So this is my only real chance to correct it if I'm off center. I just need to make sure that I've actually lined up well all 4 quadrants. So back to the bench.
So Rachel,
Yep.
your solder, you didn't roll it down. It's just a little tiny bit, smaller than normal.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, this is, somebody else, maybe Francesca calls it glitter solder, and it's completely right. It's Rio Grande. Everybody has something like it, but Rio's is particularly tiny. And so it's just chip solder in itty bitty bits. And I'm actually picking up 2 or 3. They're so small.
Okay, yeah, I have it in Easy from Rio, and it's tiny.
Yeah, Easy is the only size I don't use this in, but I probably should. It's just that I didn't want to spend the money. I use Easy solder so little in general that I didn't want to spend the money because they only sell it in like ½ ounce units or something absurd, don't they? So I just haven't bothered getting it, but absolutely I have it for this purpose and for small scale chain work. To help myself limit my solder, but you could make your own. You can roll down your wire, any number of alternatives. You can just cut it out of sheet solder. So what am I not liking about this? And is it fixable from here? So what I'm not liking is that I've got slightly different angles, but that's going to get corrected. So meaning some of them are angling more steeply than others, but that's going to get corrected by putting in the next ring. That is not the problem with this particular stage of soldering. I just need to make sure that north, south, and east, west are opposite one another. And I'm pretty happy with that. And I've got one last solder to do on this step. And then we move on to fitting the other ring. Where did I put tweezers? There they are. So once more, holding opposite the side we're about to solder, hopping back to the brick soldering station, whatever the heck this is called today. The place where the fire goes. That's what I'm going to call it from here on out. Once you get the hang of this, definitely try one that you've done with square wire. It's a whole different look with such a subtle change that it's just got some cool stuff, you know, gives you some cool variety. And the other thing is that these can be done out of half round with the half side facing in.
When using square wire, would you use the same gauge, 16 gauge square?
Yeah, probably, because square wire is actually heavier. I mean, you could potentially go down a step thinner. Very hot here. Hang on. Come on, little guy. I'm bending my prong. I'm getting too hot. No. This solder not want to flow. Oh. So we have our first challenge. I unsoldered one side, and then it corrected. So the nice thing about those little channels that we've made is that if it comes undone, it sometimes just settles back into the setting. So this prong went wonky on me, and I'm going to pause long enough to correct the bend that I'm getting so it doesn't get worse. So this one flowed again, moved, and then set itself right back into the spot it was in. Which is going to happen. You just have to check to make sure that it did in fact set itself back in. But what I've got going on here is I've got a overheating happening on the prong that I'm trying to solder. Because this is it gets exponentially harder as you get down to the further settings. And I think part of it is that I'm not getting flow because I haven't pickled it all between all of these steps. I'm really grubby. So I'm going to toss this in the pickle once I straighten it and get it cleaned up before we try again and take any questions.
Yeah, Rachel,
Yep.
if you want to use square wire, do you have to compensate with the notches?
So yes, you meaning you need to make square notches for square wire?
Right.
Yes. Because what
Okay.
again, the whole purpose of, well, there's two purposes to that notching. One is it integrates the material a little better so that it's part of the whole, its whole unit instead of just resting on the outside. But the more important is giving you more surface area for the solder to hold what needs to
Right.
become the flex point of the thing. So yes, you absolutely want a little notch in, you know, I would start probably still with the saw and then a triangle and then go to the square. Or possibly, yeah, I would probably end on the square. You might be able to get it with the triangle side, but, or even go to the round and then just square it off with a square file at the end.
Okay, thank
But
you.
just watch how deeply you go in, because again, the deeper we go with that channel, the more weak it becomes until we get it soldered back in place. And then it's one of the strongest points.
Great, thank you.
And also I use square wire for the rings, for the bearings sometimes too. It's kind of cool to have both. But it gives you different looks if you use a mix of round, you know, square wire bearing with round prongs, round bearing with square prongs, two different looks. And you'll see once you start playing with this, you can start adding decorative elements in between the two bearings. A lot of those are done more in either wax
Like what?
carving. Pardon?
Yeah, let's,
Like what? Decorative?
Like you could, so you could make a little squiggle. These are often done in the crown setting, which is the one that we'll go back to at a later session where it's cut out, but you can in fact build, like I've seen people do really lovely stuff where they just build a little S squiggle. I'm on the wrong image, hang on a sec. So they just make little squiggles of like gold, and you've got one ring and you've got another ring. And if your soldering is good, especially if you've done these with square wire, so you have a flat surface, you can solder in a set of gold insets all the way around between the two bearings. There are other ways to go about that too. Another one is to make those in strips and then make the whole unit, you know, so you build it flat and build in all of these components and then curve it into a setting from there. It's a slightly different kind of setting, but you'd plan for where do you want your prongs in that case in the design as you're building it. So there's like, you know, add a little bead elements, make one of them with twisted wire or something like that. What you need is a surface on which the stone can rest and a way to get your prongs over it that hold the stone firmly. All the rest is icing on the cake, as it were. Any other questions?
So when you get it out of the pickle before you solder the next ring,
Yep.
would you put the stone in just to make sure it's gonna fit or no?
On this step, it's not the fitting. We're still doing the bottom ring, so the bottom bearing. When we get to the next step, absolutely we can do that because that's going to be about where it's positioning. But we need, so after we've done this, and the reason, this is one of the most important things, the reason John doesn't have us file in those notches on the upper bearing is because we're doing it relative to how we've built this prong. So if you happen to be a little bit off, your notch is going to be where it needs to be for the setting you're making, but better still, it's going to position neatly and still get you your four quadrants. Let me see if that pickle is done doing its job. It is not, because I failed to turn it on. It's going to be a couple moments. All right, meanwhile, while that is pickling, let's talk one of these settings. No, let's say this is actually a better demo in between. I'm going to do the cut in on one of the stones, and I think I'm going to do it on one of these blue ones because you'll be able to see it better. So this is the, if you recall back in the last chapter, the setting where we've made a little cap that we need to set on top of the stone. This is the Briolette or Teardrop setting. And we can glue it, and or we can make this little ring that we carve into the stone, assuming the stone isn't too fragile for that, into which we will set a jump ring. There's my drawing board again. And this is a completely new one on me. So you're playing along at home as I learn how this one works. So we have our stone and we're going to cut a little channel all the way around it. like that. And then we're going to make a jump ring that very snugly fits in to that setting, but is pushed out just a little bit beyond the edge of the stone. And this is how this one works. The cap that we put in then gets folded down over that ring, which both forces the jump ring snugly into the channel and does the holding on, because then it's about it not being able to be pushed back above the jump ring line. I mean, the jump ring line. So this jump ring that's in here, because it's inset into the groove, acts as the stopper for the setting that's been pushed over it. That is a super sloppy drawing, but I hope it makes sense. Okay. So in order to do that, we're using a cutting wheel. If you have not played around with cutting wheels, I'm going to encourage you strongly to watch some videos, to read up a little bit. They can cut steel. In fact, if we had wanted to get a super sharp line on cutting the tips off of our tweezers, we could have cut them with this. But they're also basically fragile ceramic and will break at the drop of a hat. So not only will I be wearing a mask because of the stone, but I will also be wearing full on, keep it from flying in my face, spinning off at high speeds gear. Okay. These things break if you think too hard at them, and they break if you forget that you have one on and you just drop your pendulum from this so that it hangs down. It's going to bang against something and chip apart. It's a good thing they're cheap. You can buy them in packages of 100 or something. They come in different thicknesses and different grits. The manufacturer that I've always liked most is, what is this company name called? Bear with me a sec and I will get you the name. Moores, M-O-O-R-E-S. I should have remembered a name as close to mine as that. So Moores cutting discs are the ones that I prefer, but you can get them, like you'll get them in with your Dremel kit. They've got really thick ones that they sell for Dremels. They are also good for things like if you do fold forming, you can gouge in some of your fold line, and it'll help the crease that you put into it and things like that. So lots of opportunities to use it. Once you get comfortable with it, just know that they cut a lot. They cut hard, they cut fast. And we should be doing this with a little bit of water. That also helps keep the dust from the stones from floating up towards us. I'm just gonna actually just wet the stone as a starting point. So that's the one I've already cut. That's not the one I want to cut now. Hang on a sec. And this is going to be a little tricky for me because it's not in order for you guys to see it, I'm going to have to hold it in a somewhat awkward, not the way I would really hold it position. So let me get set up enough that you can see how I'm going to hold it. And then, so what I'm aiming to do, I'm using this to grip it. I want to be up and over in screen so that I can hold my thumb as not a stopper, because I don't ever want to be brushing this down, but as a guide, and I'm gripping this. So all of my action for moving is moving my fingers towards my thumb in a controlled manner so that I'm not cutting my thumb. Is that showing up for you guys, this action that I'm going to be working around and controlling it in very small movements as I go? Is that showing?
It's okay.
Okay. But the problem is that I have to get in close enough to be in control of it. Is that still going to be visible for you guys if I'm doing it right there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see how this works. Oops, and I need my mask. Bear with me a sec. Too many devices to wear. Now I'm going to be Darth Vader for you.
can't understand a word you're saying.
I'll show you why in a sec. Right. So, going as best I can.
So that's why we wear the protective stuff. I don't know if you guys saw it go flying apart, but it shatters.
Did you
And-
draw a line or put a rubber band or anything to follow
Ooh, I
a
like
line?
the rubber band idea is a great one. No, I drew a line before we got into class because I was having a hard time getting the mark to stay. So I figured rather than waste time with you guys while I did that, hang on a sec, let me get this off.
Did you use a Sharpie or a pencil?
So I used, what I ended up finding worked for me was I did a Sharpie down in one color and then not scored, but like marked into the Sharpie with my calipers. And then I went over the mark with a different color Sharpie. So what you can't see up close is there's a tiny little blue line amidst my black that I was working to in here. But boy, I'm on my 5th or 6th of these and it takes a lot to get it. So the tricks that I've found so far, and if you guys come up with others as you're playing around with this, I suspect it depends on the stone, like how hard or soft the stone is. But what I'm finding is I have to do a light touch pass of my line first, and then work back and forth around it to keep in that channel, just like if we'd scored a piece of metal. And that it takes a lot more than I thought to get in there. Now I'm working with chalcedony, which is, I think, fairly high on the Morse scale. Does anybody remember? So this is probably a harder stone than if, say, I had, I don't know, agate. I don't know. I never know those numbers properly, but I think you'll find that different stones will behave differently. And I'm even seeing sparks from my wheel as it's touching the stone. So the other thing is these wheels are designed to go at a fairly high speed. If you go slower, you will have more injury and you will have more breakage. So this needs to be a fairly fast spin. I'm trying to think what else.
Rachel?
Yes.
Some people like them and some people don't, but Rio makes a handpiece holder that clips onto, actually I have one right here.
Cool. Hang on, let me spotlight you so we can all see it. Oops, that's not spotlighted, that's pinned. Hang on.
This clamps onto your bench.
Yeah, nice.
And the handpiece goes in here.
Yep.
And so it will, if you're using a number 30 handpiece, and it will hold the handpiece so that you can manipulate the stone with both hands.
So
Wow.
I feel like with tiny stones, I want to be able to move the stone more than I want to be able to move the handpiece. I mean, like I need to be able to move both parts.
Right. I've used this.
Go ahead.
No, I've used this to like, cut beads in half to make cabs out of them and stuff like that, because then you can just put it in the thing and you can use both hands and stabilize yourself. But, you know, like I say,
What are you
some
holding?
people,
What are you holding the bead in when you're doing that?
usually in some, thermalock or something like that,
Oh,
you
okay.
know, because I'm just going around the center of it and I'm dipping it in water and then
Okay.
bringing it back in. But
Try-
I can hold it, you know, with both hands like
Right.
this and turn it.
Got it.
And get it from both sides
Huh.
with the cutting disc going down the middle.
Okay, so the cutting disc stays stable and therefore is less likely to snap on you because it's all going.
Well, yeah, and it stays in one position too, and so your wrist, you won't move it all back and forth, you know.
Huh.
So anyway, just
So
Cool.
Betsy, you're not using the one that Mask made for us?
they did a handpiece holder.
Yes.
Oh, no, you know, there are some, you know, this is a Fordham one. And
Yeah.
it's a little more, it's more expensive. You can get them for like 14 bucks that'll fit in a vise. But this one is adjustable, so you can change the angle.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah,
like
because
it a
the thing
lot.
is, with the less expensive ones, you can get it in the vise, but then you've got the vise and then the holder. I must have missed that event, Wendy.
So the other thing that this makes me realize is I have a smaller version of that in that I have one of the Wolf wax support systems
Right.
for doing it as a
Right.
lathe. And setting it up as a lathe is pretty much what you're doing there. So that might do the trick.
Exactly.
What I'm afraid of is I feel like I have more control when I can move both hands apart from each other if I see something going. And I'm afraid
Right.
that, but you do a lot of stone cutting and I'm not used to that holding things near
Yeah.
the sharp spinny stuff. So cool.
Yeah.
That's a neat tool. I may see if I can find one to play around with at some point.
Yeah, it comes in handy, you know. At first
Yeah.
you think, well, I don't really need it, I can hold it. But you know, some people, when you start losing strength in your hands and stuff like that, it's a good thing
Yep.
to have.
Okay, good to know. Let me remove that spotlight. Okay, so I don't know that I need to sit here and grind this while we go, but that's the gist of it is you're just going around and around until you get a deep enough notch. And what I've found is it needs to be a lot deeper than I thought it needed to be, because even if I'm using a really, really thin gauge jump ring, it still has to, you know, get like halfway into the loop so that what I've got left is what I'm able to push over when I put the cap on. So I'm still playing with getting just the right height and, you know, relationship of positioning to where the cap ends and how deep it has to go and the gauge of the ring that I'm putting in it. I'm sure all of those things are dependent on the size of the stone and the proportions we're working with. But I'll try to have one well cut so that I can set that on one of the next sessions. Did I want to say anything else about that? No, just get comfortable. It took me a while to get comfortable with cutting discs because they're just a little freaky that they snap so easily. So if you can start to get yourself comfortable with them because they're very powerful. They can do a lot for us. All right, it looks like I may be clean enough to do the next phase of this, but let's check what kind of warpage I got from that little melt out. This is not super clean, but I'm going to get that little bit of solder that I put on there. If I can get it to come off, I will. Not interfering with the next solder. All right, so I've still got my notch. That solder didn't flow into the notch. I'm still okay. I'm sort of amazed that that one that released popped so cleanly back in to its slot. But I'm feeling okay. I'm gonna do a little straightening. I'm feeling okay with this, and I think I'm gonna put it back in the tweezers. I can figure out where I put them. There we go. So opposite the side that I'm going to be soldering, grabbing the ring, grabbing the upright, now ready to solder right there. Hop back over. Okay, fluxing up. And let's get this guy soldered. So again, soft bushy flame, flicking it past. Remembering that we've now got 4 solder points that we're worried about. Go. And it gets trickier with each one. All right, so we now have our bottom layer set in place. And we're going to go back and work the top. And once again, we're going to check to make sure that we are as squared up, excuse me, as aligned as we can possibly get to our original 4 points. And if we're not, we're going to want to correct. So I've got pretty good alignment, just checking it north, south, east, west. And I want to straighten one of these prongs is insisting on bending a little bit. So I'm going to straighten that out. And the other thing that we're checking for is consistency of angle, because this is slightly following an angle based on how we put our angle in to the lower jump ring in the filing phase, right? So we want to make sure that all of our outward angles are roughly the same, or ideally exactly the same, not just roughly. So I'm just cleaning up the directions they're pointing. And the bigger your jump ring differential, the more you're going to have to angle that outward. We have a fairly small differential. So what we're aiming for now is to set up an even amount of space. Oh, come on. Fingers don't want to function today. An even amount of space between the 2 layers and enough space that, there's my stone. Row. Carmen asked what it would look like when we put that in. Enough space that when we're in there, our coulette does not go below the other jump ring, which we're not at risk of with the proportions we've got here. Yeah.
Can we
So
adjust
rough,
it a little bit more?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So we're going to put a little less space because we've still got the luxury of getting a little closer together. Stone out of there to do that though. What we're looking for, and we're now on page, where are we? Page 90. We're going at the bottom of page 97. And I want to make note of the passage halfway down the right-hand column. The upper bearing is left unnotched until this point for good reason. Despite your best efforts to measure as accurately as possible, minute differences in the spacing between prongs can result in a skewed arrangement. So that's why we haven't marked this one up, but now we are going to mark a top, just like we did on the other one. And we're going to position it ever so slightly above where we expect it to go. So oh, I forgot a spot that he wants us to do all the time. So John always wants you to use the seam of the jump ring, of the bearing ring, as one of your solder points. I hate that because that makes it harder to keep it from opening up, but I'm going to try to remember to do that this time if I can figure out where I put my solder point. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to start by marking one quadrant at the seam. I should have done this on the other bearing to follow the John Cogswell way. Seam. Mark it with my tool.
Rachel, I'm so sorry to have to ask you to move your head, but
Sure, sorry, I'm nearsighted,
No,
so
no,
whenever I'm
it's
doing
just
small scale work.
interesting. It's just interesting to see how you mark it. Yeah.
So I just scored a mark in the seam line so that I would remember to start there. I'm
Okay.
lining it up. And again, this is actually a lot easier if you print out one of the paper circle templates so that you're just putting your stone on it. This is just what I had because I could not for the life of me find my printed copy when I went and realized it wasn't where I expected it to be. Bear with me, that did not mark well. Okay. And we're going to make sure that those marks actually line up with our lines. If they don't, we're going to mark according to with our prongs as we've got them designed. If not, we're going to remark to the actual prongs because that's what John means by them not always being perfectly lined up. And that is in fact the case with mine. I've got one that is ever so slightly off. Get in the line, straighten out. I'm going to mark these with a different color because I'm not seeing it cleanly on here. So what I'm doing is just making sure that my marks not only are as close to opposite each other, but also that I correct if I'm not perfect on the lower rung. And I still need to know where my top side is because once again, we're going to take the saw and start our mark points with the saw blade. Give ourselves a little guidance.
I feel like I've missed a step. So is this the second ring?
It is, yeah. Remember, we made both rings to start with. We first made, in fact, we made this ring first. We just didn't mark it up until later. And then we made the second smaller or equal size, depending on what you want for a look, ring, and used that as the bottom. That's what we marked up first and soldered our pieces to, because
Right.
we're working our way up the angle. So order of operations, the way that John does it, is actually quite nice. It's a little less frustrating than trying to build from the platform down, because as long as we start knowing that we have a ring that is the right size for the platform, that's why we make it first, then everything else is built to that ring. I hope that made some kind of sense.
I don't know. I guess I thought you had soldered both already.
So I soldered the rings together, but I didn't solder them onto things yet. Because we can't mark the second position set until we have a completed frame attached to the bottom. So what you saw me doing was the first U and then the second U. And now what I'm doing is lining these marks up with the prongs that I had soldered onto that, the U output. And I'm making sure that I'm keeping a similar angle to what I started with on the lower ring. So I always need to know what my top is. And then I'm going to use either my Chenier or my nice tiny little round file, if I can figure out where I managed to drop it.
Okay, so we're on page 98 then.
We are on page 98, yes. So we've
Okay.
just done the item 2 where we mark, and now I'm in the middle of setting up the filing for those spots. Oops, that's not the right one.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Chenier for now. That side. So once again, I'm careful to try and keep that consistent angle coming up from the bottom. And I need to make these notches partway through and wide enough for the 16 gauge prongs that are going to set in them. And keep in mind, we're going to do variations on this throughout this section of the book, because you're going to get that it's the same basic principles. There's just a couple differences in how we set up the prongs in preparation for attaching them as we add additional limbs, as it were. So hopefully you'll start to get some sense of it the more we do. And we'll do a couple of odd shapes as well. Eventually we'll do a marquee, and one of my favorites is when we get to the pair settings, because then you're using a combination of prong and sort of a partial wall. So once you start mixing and matching the sheet prongs with the wire prongs, you get to some really interesting visual impact. Okay, I'm going to check this as to how it sets. If your prongs are off a little bit, I should have really notched one, marked one as my starting point on the loop, because if they're off, you may need to have it set back in exactly to the same, number 1 prong to number 1 slot kind of thing. Back here, giving me trouble. So I need to tighten up the prongs towards each other a little bit more, because I made them so close to the same size ring that it's having a hard time holding the rings in place. Make sure we're still straight up and down. Get lined up. Okay, so now I'm going to start caring about the relationship of the height of the prongs. I have to make sure that I'm happy with the distance between what I'm putting on, which is the upper bearing, and the lower bearing. It has to at least cover, does my coulette not poke out the back. And so the very first solder I do with this, again with the tweezers, which I keep putting down and losing track of, using those tweezers again, this first one is going to be the guide for the height of all of the rest, meaning I'm locked in once I've put my first solder down. And I need to make sure that my prongs are actually touching that section. First looks a little happier. So even though this is happening, meaning I can wobble it around, once I get this first piece soldered into place at the height that I want, I'll be able to make the rest solder proportionally to that. So notice we're getting into, oh, no, I'm not, I'm lying. I can't because I have to do the opposite side. All proportionally set up.
But you're only grasping that top ring. You're not grasping both of them.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. Yes, that is correct. Although, you know, it's possible that you could set up your tweezer, your tweezers so that you have a double step that would fit the right height. Like that might give you a little extra guide, but it's not going to really grip both positions because they are, you know, especially if they're tapered, they're not in straight line to what the pliers are holding.
And it's going to change each time depending on the distance between
Right.
the top.
Yeah, you'd be making a boatload of sets of pliers or a boatload of steps to make the right set. You know, you'd be making a bunch of combinations if you wanted it to work for specific settings. I've got something wonky here because I must have rotated one of these around. So I've got one a little bit further off than the others. Okay. Get into your little slot there, little guy. What I'm checking for is I keep having alignment issues on one prong, and it only gets worse if I don't have them set well before I put the first solder down. So I'm trying to make sure I have a nice clean fit. North, south, east, west again. I like the height on that. And grip this. Come on. There we go. All right. So didn't like my first notch, so I'm working on the second notch, and this is where I'm aiming to solder. And these solder joins will get progressively more frustrating as we go, because we run the risk of soldering or unsoldering the other ones that we've done. So the target on this, am I switched over? I'm on the right camera, yes. So my target is right here, what is going to be the upper level. Again, we're using hard solder. So now comes the magic, and see if we can get this because of these magical pliers helping, tweezers helping us out. Soft, bushy flame, hard solder, flux. Set that solder in there. And connected. All right. So we now have a connection for one, and our next step is to get an even amount of spacing to get to the other side. So one of the ways you can do that is something consistent pushed between them. Back of a pair of tweezers. Make sure you've got the same size, same height rather. You can put T-pins in there, but depending on your precision, personal precision levels that you want, you may go in and take calipers and really measure it. But I've now got the stability of one connection point that I can hold on to. So I can now go, gotta be the right direction on the pliers though, tweezers. So now I can set myself up for that second one. I'm in my notch. I'm now aiming for this solder point opposite the one I just did. And if your stuff is getting too grubby for the solder to flow quickly, it's okay. You can always pause and pickle. Light bushy flame, flickering past. It's going to want to melt out the one above it. That's one of the challenges. So it's starting to get a little hot up towards the second one. See if I can get a little more solder in there. Okay, what I'm finding is I might not have a tight enough fit because I'm getting great flow on the upper prong, but the lower one is just not going where I want it to go. So I'm going to quench it, make sure I've got a snug enough connection there. And I'm going to definitely want to pickle this again because it's really, really grubby right there. So I want to make sure I got a clean fit before I go any further. And you guys can see how this progresses, right? It's a lot of steps. Well, that's pickling. We can chat more. It's a lot of steps, but once you get a routine down, and if you're making a bunch of settings for the same size stone, boy, make these all in a row. Boom, boom, boom. Do all of your jump rings. Do all of your first level notches and first level feet or first level prongs. You know, get it so that you get a routine and it'll become easier. And you'll also find the places that stop you, stop you up. That getting the soldering going is really the toughest first phase of it. Questions while we wait for that to pickle?
So you were saying to get the distance between the top and the bottom ring or vice versa.
Yep.
To use the back of your tweezers?
I used anything that I can get a consistent thickness. So I was looking for something that was roughly, so I'd already designed, I already designated how high it was going to be by the very first solder I did on that. What I then needed to do was find something that was consistent in the height between those two solder points that I could use as a stopper to get myself positioned. That's all. It was just a measuring gauge to bump it up against.
A visual. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, pencil. Yeah, it depends on the scale of the piece you're working on. It could just be your soldering pick. Just make sure it's not tapered, whatever it is, and you'll be all set. I'm trying to think what else I've seen people use. I mean, heck, you can use another piece of wire, or if you have some scrap heavy gauge binding wire. That's one that you can even potentially, if you're having a real hard time with things floating and tilting on you, which is a common occurrence when you're making these. You could run a crosshatch of binding wire, heavy gauge binding wire between it. Just know that you risk overheating things because the steel is there. So steel is a dangerous, it's a love-hate relationship with the silver work. Trying to think what else I would potentially use. I mean, technically you could use the same thing that people do for hinges sometime, which is pencil lead. If you're working really small, get the pencil leads that are used in mechanical pencils and just run a few of them in there. And you can even leave them there while you're soldering because they won't solder attached. And they work well for when you're trying to keep a hinge pin together. So they should work well for that. Anybody else ever worked with some other things to get your nice precise measurements? And by nice precise, I mean approximate, the way that you get them when you put something between two levels.
Well, I was thinking of the titanium clips
Hmm.
to use as a measurement.
As
I
a
don't know.
measurement and then take them out, or would you leave them in there while you're soldering? Are you looking for
Well, it
something?
depends on how difficult, I guess.
Yeah, I'm trying to think whether, so it's fairly close in heating that you're doing. The titanium will only survive so much of that, but maybe, yeah, titanium doesn't steal the heat the way that steel does, so that's a good possibility. Or maybe even just shims of it, like have different thicknesses of pieces of.
Yeah.
Okay, my pickle just doesn't want to stay turned on today, apparently. Probably because I had it down too low. There we go. All right, well, we're gonna see if we can get it with this slightly grubby still piece, because I don't want to wait for the pickle. So I am once again just making sure that the side opposite what I have just soldered is a clean fit on that second ring before I go in and do more soldering, because I didn't get a full solder down on the second side. It's not enough, and my distance is consistent. Let's pop back over to the bench and give it a second shot. Wrong one. Here we go. Okay. Continue that way. Aiming for the right one. Yes, I am. Soft, bushy flame. A little bit of hard solder. Oh. Okay, so our last chance to start lining things up is this phase where we are now making sure that, so our north-south, we'll call it, is lined up. Now we got to make sure that our east-west is in line with the little notches and in line with one another, and that we're looking good on all fronts for being upright. We're going to take our little magical tweezers and pick a side. I'm sure I got one of the ones that I haven't actually soldered. Clip. So we're doing this joint right here. Whoop. And go. And our final joints on the other side. Sure nothing moved out of place on us in the meantime. Looking pretty good.
I could almost see it with a little ring on the top and made into earrings upside down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would be cool. I'd do it a little bit neater on my two little U's if I were going to do that, probably. But yeah. Yeah, I mean, once you learn this series of steps, you can make cages, you can do all kinds of cool things. So don't be surprised to see your other connection flow a little bit as you do the final steps, because we're in close to one another. So we now have theoretically 8 lovely prong joints going on. I'm just checking them to make sure that I didn't lose anything in the process. I don't think I did. That one could use a little more. I'm seeing one that I've got good flow on one side, but it didn't get all the way through. Hoping I'm not jinxing myself by trying to do a touch-up solder. See how we do on that one. Get that spot there. A little bit more flow on that one right there. And that may not show up until you actually pop it back in the pickle, because you should be using such small bits of solder for this that you can't really sometimes tell if you didn't get the full flow. Come on. That makes me happier. Okay. Quench. We're going to pickle, and then we're going to trim. And we have a prong setting. Excuse me, a basket setting specifically. Questions?
Whoop, whoop.
And we're going to trim only a rough trim on this because we want to leave ourselves enough leeway to play with prongs. And I think there's a section in here where John talks about different shapes of prongs that you can do. There's some split prongs, there's some pointed ones, some squared off ones. You can finish them off with a cup burr to get a nice clean look. They each have slightly different sort of eras where they were very popular. So they changed the look of the same, if you can make a set of 4 or 5 and do a different prong top on each of them for yourself, you'll see that you can get really different effects with subtle changes, and it's quite elegant.
At what point do you consider whether you would want to pen it or put it on a ring? Or
so I tend to not make basket settings until I have a project for which it's going, because they're such a pain in the butt to make with all those solder joints. So I would know beforehand, because, for example, if I were making a pendant that was nothing but a big basket set stone, I might try to build my bail into the lower bearing or something like that, or I might solder it before I finish some of the other solders. I'd have to decide what my order of operations is. If I'm just making it for the sake of the exercise, or I want to have a bunch made for future use. One of the reasons we're using hard solder is that if we need to then attach it to a bail or attach it to a project, we can go to the medium, and you should feel unbelievably proud the first time you do one of these and you have just managed to do 10 hard solders in a row. This 4-prong has 10 hard solders all in a row, close together. It's why I'm telling you to start on a big one, because it gets much harder the smaller you get. Okay. And John uses a big torch for everything. I personally, when I'm getting small little settings, I will move down to a smaller step. If you happen to be using as your primary torch an oxyacetylene Smith Little torch, know that this is going to be a little more challenging. It's harder to get a bushy flame on that. It's a fairly precise flame. So err on the side of a really short flame and do a lot of that flicking, because it'll overheat in a heartbeat. But the benefit of the little guys is that you can keep it concentrated more towards where you're trying to solder. So there's a balance there. In gold, you're going to be doing this with a mini torch. It's the only way to get that close solder. Not the only way, but it's much harder to get the close solder that you need on the gold.
You mean a
without-
Smith Little?
With a Smith Little, yeah. Yeah. Sorry, it's been a very long day. I'm going to see if that's coming out of the pickle. And I think I am going to call it as once I finish trimming this so that you can see the basics, I'm going to call it a night from my perspective, but we can then do our show and tell and talk about what'll happen next session. Just because it's been a long week already and it's only Wednesday. So it's finished pickling, but I'm going to bring it out anyhow. A little bit scrubbed. John really likes us to finish things with a brass brush for a couple reasons. One, it puts sort of a natural soft finish that silver likes to be in, the state that that silver wants to return to. So he does brass brushing on everything, but it also takes off that last little bit of what the pickle is. The silver bits are getting burnished in, the last of the copper is coming off when you do that burnish. So he does that on pretty much every pass. It also, theoretically, if you're doing more solders, by taking that fine coating of silver down a little bit, it gives you a better surface to solder to. I do not make it a steady habit, and I should, to do the brass brush every time. If you are like me and you hate the basic wooden brass brush that's really prickly, Tevel at Allcraft has a plastic handled one with a soft brush. Changes the world of brass brush use. So I am now just going to do my clippy on the U ends to get it trimmed away from the wheel, from the frame that we did. And I have a basic basket. And we hope that my stone is still suited to this, because otherwise I'll be making another one. So this one didn't end up with very much of an angle between the bottom and the top, but it'll fit that stone nicely, because what I'm seeing is that so the stone wants to do a little tipping when it's in here, which means that my sizing is pretty good, because remember, we're going to be pushing in and we're going to be putting little notches in our prongs as the fold over point, as the catch point. So your stone isn't going to fit perfectly flat until those are done, but you'll get the sense of it. And you can see I can trim a ton of material away and still leave myself plenty for later decisions. Because I only need to go onto the beginning facet of the circumference of the stone when I'm pushing my prong down. I don't need it to go way over up onto the table. So there is, let me bring it over to our super duper camera. There is our little prong setting. Ready to be cleaned up, trimmed up. Have the prongs, oops, that's really lousy focus, isn't it? Let me back out a little bit. It'll let, we'll do cleaning up and filing, get all the nice, neat look at the bottom. But we've got a fairly clean, consistent size all the way around. We've got nice 4-corner, north, south, east, west. And it's good to go. We will hopefully not spend quite the level of detailed time on some of the other variations on this. I'll sort of deep dive down into some of the specifics of the different shapes and combos, like, when we're doing it for a different shape of stone, or when we're doing a 5 instead of a 4-prong, that kind of thing. I'll try to go a little faster through the filing and prep of the rings and that sort of thing. Just so that we're not doing one per session, because that'll kill me. But there's also a lot fewer settings in this chapter. And I think that what I will probably try to do is finish the last of, I think we got 4 stones from last chapter that I still want to set in front of you guys, unless there are others that you go, oh, we'd really like to see you set that specific setting. So what I'll do is I'll try to get those settings interspersed with us making new settings, and then we'll start setting the settings we've been making this chapter so that we're not piling them all up to the end based on what you guys said. So I'll try to get in at least one setting and one making of a new setting every session, hopefully a couple of settings each session once we get moving. Questions? Show and tell? Anybody got stuff they're proud of that I can see?
I do.
Okay, Carmen, hang on a sec. Let me spotlight you. If I can get my Zoom to respond. There we go. Add spotlight. Come on. Hang on, it's being bad. My Zoom for some reason doesn't like being on the second camera. All right, what do you got?
I did my
Ooh.
first.
Is that a back
Yeah.
set?
That's the bullet.
Yep. Oh, straight up bullet. So front set bullet. That looks beautiful.
Yeah, and I used my new hammer.
Do you like it?
Oh, I love it.
What gauge metal did you use for that?
This was the thick one. This was the one that we did a while ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was trying to figure out, it was really thick. And I thought, I think I'm going to anneal it before I set it. And then I thought, no, because that's what the hammer is for. I'm going to see if it'll take care of it. And I did anneal it. And it gave me the shape I wanted. I mean,
Nice.
it's not,
So probably an 18 gauge or something.
it was thick.
So, yeah, nice.
Yeah, it was thick.
Very cool.
It's not finished. I'm going to rivet it to another piece, but
Okay.
I wanted to get this done because the other piece that I'm going to add, it's going to kind of hide it.
Okay, cool. Did you use any glue or did you manage to just straight up set it?
I use glue.
Okay, that's allowed. That's allowed. All right.
This is the other piece that I want to
Oh,
add to
wow.
it.
Oh, that'll be fantastic.
So I'm going to try to see if I can rivet it. Is
Are
my
you-
next.
Are you thinking of blackening the material on the bottom layer or Kyumbu or anything that's going to be showing through around it? Or is it going to be silver on silver?
Silver on silver, I think.
Okay, that's a super cool
So-
piece.
Oh, thank you.
Nice.
That's what I did. And then this whole thing here, I use Gorilla Tape or carpet tape. Have you ever heard of that?
Yep. Yep, the double-sided
tape.
stuff.
And I added the piece to it on a piece of wood because I didn't do the jet set thing and I wasn't really sure. So,
Nice.
and that worked. It didn't come off when I used it.
I'm impressed that a heavy set thing, that carpet tape kept that down. That's very cool.
Yeah, I did. It's still on there.
Okay. Somebody else got stuff to show? Paula, it looks like you got stuff.
Yes.
Hang on. Let me get you up, except that this stupid screen won't let me spotlight. Add the spotlight. Please add the spot. Oh, there we go. All right,
Okay,
what do you
this-
got?
This is from your,
The holoforms piece.
yeah,
Oh my goodness.
Oh.
it's not finished. I still have to do the edges.
But you got the
the-
star set.
Yes,
Holy cow, that's fantastic.
I did a step bezel in there so that
Okay.
I could push the spikes right into the, you know, so that it had a place to sit so it wouldn't fall through
Cool.
while I was soldering it. I soldered it, you know, so,
What a great solution.
yeah.
That is amazing. How are you how are they wearing it? Is it being jump ringed? Is it being
No, I have I did a tube
right?
through there and I have the,
Fantastic. Okay, you're gonna have to send me a finished photo of that one.
yeah.
That's amazing. It looks just like you described you wanted it to look too at the start of that class.
Yeah,
Very cool.
thank you.
Anybody else? Hey,
Untraditional, so it's contemporary.
what is the
Oh.
material? Is that enamel or is that?
This one is a dendritic opal.
Ooh, pretty,
That's gorgeous.
very pretty. And check out that prong setting. Look at I love that you've done the double, you've turned the U into the prong.
Yeah, that seemed to hold it much better, and it gives a nice design element to the opal shape. So,
Yeah. And it somehow manages to follow the movement of the dendrites that you've got, but not,
yeah, right.
but it's enough distinguished. And I like that you blackened it to go along with the edging. That's fantastic. What's the neck piece on? Is that rubber or?
It's a non-allergenic, I don't know, some kind of surgical rubber. So I have to put, I just generally put magnetic catches on there. So I haven't yet done that.
Cool. So it's tubing. So you're going to set the magnet inside the ends?
I put magnets in a tube and then put a silver wire through the tubes onto the rubber.
Got it. So you're riveting it basically onto the rubber.
Yeah, riveting
That's
it,
super
yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Where did you find dendritic opal? That's beautiful.
This one, I should look it up. I've had it for a long time, so I look it
Yeah,
up. Maybe next time I'll share that.
I've never seen one that big.
It's
I have
fantastic.
some, but it's smaller. It's beautiful.
And
Thank
the polish it holds is really lovely too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great design.
Thank
All
you.
right. Anybody else? All right, gang, unless I'm missing somebody that's waving at me that they want to do stuff, then have a wonderful night. I will try to put this out in the next week or so, but I have a show, not this weekend, but the following, I back-to-back shows starting next weekend up in the Seattle area. So if you happen to be in the Pacific Northwest, I'll be in Bellevue 2 weeks from, not next weekend, but the weekend after, and I'll be at Anacortes the weekend after that. You can come by and say hi in person.
Good luck with your shows.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
guys.
Fabulous class. I loved
Thanks.
it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.